Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you, probably already close to the afternoon. My name is Konstantin von Eggert, and I come from Moscow, and I have the honor to moderate this session on whether Syria can be saved. And as the old Meri Chapman Carpenter song goes, I feel lucky today because as a Russian with a typically Russian name, I'm tired of answering a question at the international conferences, why Russia vetoed the Security Council resolutions on Syria. So I'm tired of reminding everyone that my name is not Vladimir Putin or Sergei Lavrov, so I hope I'll be saved and delivered from this fate today. And we have a very distinguished panel to discuss this issue today. And we have Carl Bildt, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden. We have Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, who is the Special Government Representative to Business on Cybersecurity and the former security advisor to David Cameron's government and a former governor of the BBC, which for me is extremely pleasing. We have Ambassador Ömer Önhon, Ambassador of Turkey to Syria, now not living in Damascus for obvious reasons, but still coordinating the Syrian policy on the Turkish policy on Syria, Freudian slip. And we have Alaa Murabit, who represents an NGO, Voice for Libyan Women. And of course, last but not least, Kurt Volker from the McCain Institute for International Leadership, formerly for how many years with the State Department? 23. So we're all set for that. And the title of the panel is, can Syria be saved? And actually, my question is that, what are we saving Syria from? Are we saving it, or are we talking about saving it from the Assad dictatorship? Are we trying to save it from the onset of some kind of Muslim Brotherhood-dominated Islamist regime? Are we saving it from a complete collapse and disintegration? Another question that I would like the panelists to answer after the first one is, what is the role of regional actors there? Because if you look at even the Russian press, lots of people are saying this is a very specific thing. This is about the Sunnis versus the Shias and the Alawis. Others are saying it is a first shot in the war between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Sheikdoms against Iran. So what it is really, and it would be really interesting to hear from people coming from the region and living there. And thirdly, what is the role of the non-regional actors, the EU, Russia, and the United States? And the perennial question, to what extent and why and how Syria is different from Libya and doesn't warrant intervention. So I hope to hear answers about that too. And without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Alaa Murabit. Ahlan wa sahlan bi'asimat Estonia. Welcome to the Estonian capital. And the floor is yours to explain to us how it is seen from a country that was very hotly in the news very recently, slightly displaced by Syria now. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. As you said, I'll touch base on the three questions kind of within the context of my own experience in Libya. I do not know how much background everyone has on the conflict in Libya, but I, for the duration of the whole conflict, was in a city called Zawiya, which is 20 minutes away from the capital and was the second hardest hit city. Now, with Zawiya, the important thing to note is that the no-fly zone, which was instrumented by NATO and Resolution 1973, did not actually make much of an impact initially, because Zawiya rose up in late February and was squashed by the Gaddafi regime on March 10th, before the no-fly zone came into effect on March 17th. For that reason, I see the Syria situation a lot like Zawiya during those 3 weeks. Unfortunately, Syria has been going through it for a much longer period of time. But for those 3 weeks, Zawiya had the bulk of Gaddafi's military force in the west concentrated there, and he was killing his own civilians with no reprimandation from the international community, but we heard a lot of discussion. There was a lot going on with Sarkozy and Cameron saying there needs to be something done. yet nothing had been done. When I look at Syria, and your first question of Syria being saved from what? I remember that was the big discussion even in Libya, was, okay, we're going to remove, this will only ultimately lead in the removal of a dictator, but what will he be replaced with? And I understand it's a valid question. And people are, for the most part, xenophobic and are not quite aware of what they will be putting in that place and fear what they don't know. But at the same time, Syria, much like Libya, has an opposition council, the same as our transitional council was. They have promised, and I understand that a lot of people do not necessarily take the Muslim Brotherhood for their word, but they have promised that this is not something in which they are simply trying to use to get power. These are issues that have been brought up because Syrians themselves, not the Muslim Brotherhood, not the Saudis or any other regime, came in and started this revolution. This was a revolution started by Syrian people, peacefully, for one simple word, and that's dignity. They wanted, and the values that are held up in the Western world, in Europe, in the States, and hopefully now in many countries in the Middle East that have undergone revolutions, is the value for human life and for those rights and for that dignity. So when it comes to why Libya is any different than Syria, I understand that every country has its own interests, and it will act on its own interests. That is something that I think goes without saying. But there's also that responsibility to protect, which we were so eager to use in February of 2011. And countries literally, and I know that you said you don't want to be responsible for Russia, but unfortunately, you will be. But countries like Russia, which the first time around, and now the second time around, are allowing the death of innocent civilians. And the fact that we now have Libya, the Transitional Council has been very honest about its support for the Syrian opposition, giving it $100 million, has supported it with arms, with trained militia, albeit we're not that trained, but we've tried. And of course, taking in Syrian refugees by the thousands. And it was actually a young Syrian refugee who said to me once that their perception, the same way Russia must have a perception of this being Shiite versus Sunni, their perception is that, much like in Bahrain, the life of a human is worth less than a barrel of oil. So he tells me, don't think you're special because you're from Libya. The only thing that makes you special is you have more money than us. You matter just more because you have oil. And that is the perception that the international community, by being completely ineffective, is giving. That's not to say that the regional community has done very well either. But I think that for us to say that this is something that the Arab countries will do on their own is unrealistic, because they never have done anything like this on their own. And I, as an Arab, I, as a Libyan woman, can honestly say that I do not think they have the ability to follow through on something on their own. They don't, unfortunately. And they proved that with Libya. Nothing was actually done until the UN agreed upon it. They showed their support for action, which is the same that they, along with Turkey, have done in Syria. They've shown their support for action. They've shown their willingness to act. But being realistic, regional countries cannot do this on their own. And if they tried to, it would take much longer. It would be much messier, and it would result in a lot more, I would say, aftermath than if you had a very concentrated international action. Because if once you get each regional country trying to do its best with no knowledge or no history or no understanding of what exactly they're doing, you're going to have a very messy, uncoordinated result. So in my personal opinion, I think that when it comes to all the excuses we always have of what the next regime or what the next government may be, we have to remember that this was done by a peaceful demonstration of people, which then led to their own government attacking them. Having been in that position, I can honestly say who they vote for in 5 years, if they ever get to vote, unfortunately, but who they vote for, that's the meaning of democracy. We cannot separate the fact that there are Islamic groups in the Middle East, the same way there are Christian groups in Europe. This is something that goes hand in hand. So we cannot keep using that as an excuse not to take action when lives are being lost on a daily basis, the lives of children, the lives of women, by their own regime.
So Syria should be saved from the Assad dictatorship. That's your position, essentially. Not from the Islamists and not from the collapse.
Well, I don't think the Islamists have really done anything. I mean, they've only ever written a statement saying that they are not using this as a method to get into power. And I don't think we can keep judging them simply because of their basic ideology that they've had previously or that they may have in the future. It's like putting a man in jail before he's even committed the crime. It's not fair. And in this case, it's not just putting him in jail, but it's allowing for the death of over 10,000 people simply because you fear that in the future they may do something. At the end of the day, is really that fear more important than the fact that the regime is currently killing these people? Does your fear of what they might potentially do outweigh the fact that he is killing people publicly with no remorse every day?
Ambassador Önhon, Turkey has been spearheading regional effort with regard to Syria, but at the same time, if I may, I'm not going to let you off the hook easily. Only a couple of years ago, Prime Minister Erdogan and Bashar al-Assad were backslapping, and suddenly Mr. Erdogan has seen the light and found out that the Assad family has been running the place as a crude dictatorship for 40 years plus. How do you explain this change, and how do you see it on a more sort of forward-looking basis? How do you see the regional policy, coordination, as well as do you agree with Alaa that one needs a broader international pressure to be brought into Syria and the Arabs and the Turks will not be able to do it on their own?
Okay.
Please.
Thank you. Well, it's very nice to be in Tallinn. I'll try to give some insight on Syria and what Turkey's perception is. You are right in saying that Turkey and Syria were very close until a year ago. They didn't go as far as backslapping, but they were very close. And it's only normal. I mean, we have very deep social and historical ties with Syria. We have lived together for almost 500 years. And only take aside a few years, maybe 10, 20, which is nothing in 500 years, I think we really had excellent relations between peoples. I mean, we all lived under the same roof. And starting in year 2000, our relations between Turkey and Syria improved to a point that I would have never guessed. I mean, I served in Syria before from 98 to 2000. And I really thought there was much opportunity between the two countries, but I would have never thought that it would come to such levels, but it did. We abolished visas, our trade volume boosted to 2.5 billion, and many more things. But then things started to evolve in the Middle East with the Arab Spring, or whatever you may call it. And in February, before things started in March, our Prime Minister, when he visited Syria for the building of a joint dam, he met with President Assad and very openly explained to him that something is happening in the region and he should do something about it in his own country. And I can tell you that he was extremely open in giving his sound advice. But unfortunately, this advice was not taken, and in March, in Syria, everything started to fall apart. I mean, it was the beginning. I totally agree with Alaa that it would be very unfair, extremely unfair on the Syrian people to label this revolution, I will call it, this revolution as one started by certain groups or Islamic fundamentalists, or a revolution engineered by foreigners and so on. This is extremely unfair. It was really a call by the people, and the slogan was dignity, and dignity it was. Now, what happened was, unfortunately, the regime acted in a very, I would say, unwise way. I mean, the demands were legitimate. if you look at the demands in March and the slogans, you will see how naive and how pure they were, and they really were. But then the regime cracked down on them. I mean, they used weapons, they shot on demonstrators, and they acted very unwisely because probably that was the only way that they knew how to react. But then, of course, this escalated. I mean, if people see that their relatives are killed and their loved ones are arrested, then they start to react out of anger, but also for self-defense. And this is what happened in Syria. And unfortunately, crisis escalated and it got out of hand. Now, thousands of people have perished, really. I mean, the figure is about 13,000, 12,000, I don't know, but I think even more. But then it's not only that, the number of people who are killed, but thousands of people have been put into prison, put into torture. And, you know, that's not just gossip, that is an established fact, unfortunately. And if you multiply, and hundreds and thousands of people, tens of thousands of people have been put into refugee status. I mean, you see tens of thousands of people, displaced people within Syria, and then you see thousands, tens of thousands of people in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in other places. I mean, many people have immigrated to other countries like France, Canada, States, what have you. And if you multiply these people by 4 or 5, by the families, I mean, you have a huge portion of the population which is very heavily affected. And again, that is an established fact. Now, what did the regime do to counter that? Whatever it did, it was too little too late, I mean, as we keep saying. And that is also true. The regime, it was in a state of constant denial all the time. At the beginning, at the initial stages, they denied that there was mistreatment, that there was any crackdown on the protesters. They denied everything. But then everything was happening in front of the eyes of the people in Syria and outside of Syria. Yes, there were some reforms like the change of the constitution, the abolishment of the emergency law, elections, this, that, but I think none of them had any real meaning, because when you take a step, if you don't have the real intention behind it, then it has no meaning in practice. I mean, these reform steps may look good on paper, but in reality, they mean nothing really.
Can I break in here and just ask you, what is then to be done? And can the Assad regime survive, first, in some kind of form, reformed or unreformed? Does it have a chance for a graceful exit? And thirdly, we are talking about the Syrian people and you know, the uprising, and it's all very fine, but is there no interference at all? Is there no interest by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states to basically clamp down on what was, let's face it, for more than 30 years, an Iranian bridgehead in the Middle East, and actually the only one and the most useful one?
Well, I mean, to answer your question, again, I have to point out to some insights from Syria. First of all, the regime, unfortunately, it doesn't have the real will or the intention to stop the crisis. What it aims is to consolidate its power under whatever form. I mean, it's obvious that under the present form, they will not be able to continue. So they are trying to find a new shape under which they can still continue to rule the country as it is. But I see this very unlikely, really. I mean, it's too late for that. Now, we have to look at the facts on the ground, as I said. There are some real factors. Well, there is a section of the society in Syria. I mean, there are 3 sections. One section is against the present regime. The other section, the one on the other extreme, is for the regime for various reasons. And then there is the in-between, the people in between. And they have fears. I mean, they are not necessarily sympathizers of the regime. On the contrary, they are quite disturbed by the regime and its actions, but they have some real factors which should be, some real fears which should be addressed, I think, and that is chaos. What if the regime goes? Will there be a chaos? Will there be radicalization? Will there be civil war? Will there be sectarian strife? I mean, these are fears. And also, unfortunately, examples in surrounding countries which have gone through the same experience sometimes doesn't give much hope to these people. So the regime is feeding on these fears. So it's very important that these fears should be addressed. For example, one argument that the regime is constantly using is, or feeding in, is what if we go? There is no alternative. I mean, saying that there is no alternative is an insult to the people of this country. The people of this country, they have a very rich history. I mean, if you go back hundreds of years ago, when people were not really as prosperous as today in Europe, everything flourished in the Middle East and in that part of the Middle East, especially in Syria. And they have an accumulation, of course, and it's very unfair to say that there is no alternative. Yes, there was no opposition up until 1 year ago, because if you raised your voice, then you ended up in prison in a matter of hours. But I have to say the following. Now, there is an opposition. It may have its shortcomings, but then if we think a year ago that there was nothing, and what we have now is impressive, and we have to look to the full side of the glass and not the empty side, and try to empower, to strengthen the opposition. That does not mean interfering in Syria's affairs. It means that as nations of this international community, we cannot stay deaf and blind to what's going on in Syria.
I would like to address this straight away to Carl Bildt, who will speak for Europe today, for lack of Lady Ashton in the audience. And I'd like to ask you exactly about that. So, what can be done? Is it, when Ambassador Önhon talks about non-interfering in Syrian internal affairs, but supporting the opposition? Well, let's face it, it is interference in Syrian internal affairs. At least that's how the Assad regime will look at it. Now, what will work? More sanctions, arms deliveries to the opposition, recognizing the council and withdrawing diplomatic support, diplomatic recognition from Damascus. What can be done? Europe was pretty much playing a very prominent role during the Libyan crisis. Now it seems a bit lost not to repeat the Libyan experience. Am I right?
It's a far more complex case. I mean, that has to be said. And accordingly, you can see some reluctance among some of the major powers to carry it too far. But what can be done? I mean, I agree with you. We are in an intervention phase. I mean, what we are doing in terms of sanctions, in terms of supporting the opposition, in terms of quite a number of other activities, I mean, goes well beyond what has been done in quite a number of other cases, well beyond what we've been done in other cases. That being said, there's a sort of great debate what's going on, and let's try to broaden the picture from my point of view, because Syria is the heart of the classical Levant, and I think we are dealing with the future political order of a much broader region. I mean, from Beirut to Basra to take the entire region. And if you look at that region in a slightly longer historical perspective, since the present setup of states, I mean, the demise of the Ottoman Empire, and then the Brits and the French, as usual, were setting up a couple of states there called Syria and called Iraq, and there was Lebanon and there was Jordan. They've always been, throughout history, ruled by minorities. There's been authoritarian minority rule all over this particular region throughout history, more or less. It came to an end, a rather brutal one, in Iraq in 2003. But up until then, it had been a minority rule there. Syria, minority rule, essentially set up by the French with the Alawites, because they were the ones that could be relied on to sort of support some sort of stability in this rather unruly part. Lebanon was, of course, ruled by a Christian minority until that particular place blew up in a civil war that lasted for no less than 18 years. With devastating consequences. It is now ruled by an extremely complex and exceedingly fragile ethnic arrangement, let's call it like that. The entire region must now do the transition from the authoritarian minority secular regimes of the past to majority democratic regimes, unlikely to be secular, by the way, likely to be Islamist, but that's their choice, of the future. And the question is, how do you do the transition? It can be done by war and conflict. And the problem with that particular approach is that the risk of the region descending into civil war is the almost certainty that that will be a sectarian civil war that is deep and broad and long. And what's going to come out of it is not entirely certain. It does open up also the Kurdish issue in a way which we haven't seen since 1917 as well, by the way. So the future of the entire region will be at stake. Lebanon is living by the day only as things are now. Now, this is the one horror scenario that is there. And this is the reason why everyone is now trying to see, is there a political process? That's the Kofi Annan plan. How do we calm down the violence? Observers have calmed down the violence. Can that go on? Can it sort of calm down even more? Can it stop the violence? And even more important, can there be a transition to a political process for what we could call a radical regime evolution in Damascus that makes this transition that I talked about in a way that maintains the region intact and minimizes the number of lives that are going to be lost. And that can only be done by applying substantial pressure. Sanctions being part of that. Sanctions, there are downsides to it. I mean, we are destroying the middle class of the country at the moment. But the regime can't pay the wages. I mean, already they're cutting all wages in half. Not necessarily those of the soldiers. That's in the nature of things when you do these things. But at some point in time, it will have an impact also on the politics of it. That's really what we need to try to do, to see if this works. Has it a 100% chance of success? No, it doesn't. But even if the chance of success is 2%, I think we need to try to do it, because the alternative might be truly horrible of a regional dimension for quite some time to come.
Baroness Neville-Jones, to you, two things concerning the security implications of this vast change that Carl Bildt has described, and with which, by the way, I personally agree, although it's not my role as a moderator to agree or disagree, but still I do agree as someone who, as someone who was actually trained as an Arabist and who lived in the Middle East for quite some time, I do think that that is an inevitable development. But there are several security implications for that. If you have the Islamist, even moderate Islamist regimes all over the place, there is a question of what will happen to Europe's and America's relationship with Israel. Do we have to take Israeli concerns on board here? Second thing, minorities. And I like the Turkish ambassador's description of this vast middle ground, which is concerned about things. And there are Christians there, and they actually have Christian relatives living in Syria. So I do understand that it is a concern also for Europe. If you treat your minorities well, do you have to protect minorities in the Middle East? And then how you do it? Most of them are Shia and Christians, of course, in this circumstance. So what is your take on that?
Well, let me say, I think that the Syrian situation is now extremely serious, and we've been preoccupied with Iran. I think we should be thinking very hard about Syria. And indeed, these two crises may in the end fuse. So it is the one, I think, that's coming extremely fast down the track. And governments, I think, if they're privately in their chancelleries, should be thinking about what the implications of potential military intervention are. I don't think it's something we should rush for. It has huge downsides, but I don't think we can any longer just simply say this isn't something that we should even begin to look at. However, I agree with what Carla said, is that the process that's underway at the moment is clearly to try and lower the level of violence and provide in that space a lower level of violence some political process. Now, I can sense widespread skepticism that actually the Assad regime is going to play ball. It hasn't so far, and I must say I share that skepticism about whether it will in the future. Will it get frightened enough actually to do so? Very good question. My own bet is very, very small chance of that happening. What are the implications of the present situation? What are the implications of the alternatives? Clearly, if we go for military intervention, not simple, and I'll come to that in just a moment, but it will have a number of consequences immediately. First of all, of course, it's going to aggravate very greatly the economic crisis that we're already suffering from. I mean, the oil price is going to shoot through the roof. There will be an increase in terrorism. We should be quite aware of that. And there will be instability. It will increase and aggravate the instability that is already visible in other Arab and Gulf states. This is not an isolated case. I might ask Kurt, when he talks, actually to explain to us why the US does not consider the Middle East to be the most unstable, the most insecurity spreading part of the world, and is very preoccupied these days with Asia. I would say this is actually the top and urgent priority. I don't dispute, obviously there are long-range issues in Asia as well, but really this is where it is, I think. So the question is, will we be better off trying to flog on as we are at the moment, or do we have to go for more radical solutions? My concern increasingly is that without military intervention, which I say I don't want, but that we are going to have increase in terrorism anyway, that the sorts of instability that the regime is generating, including the possibility of sectarian warfare inside the country, are also potentially going to get going, even in the absence of actually there being more radical plans afoot. So I'm very concerned that actually we don't, that the choice between precipitating some of the consequences of military intervention and not doing so, I am not convinced myself that they're all that different. I am very concerned about the self-generating spread of insecurity as a result of the current situation. Now, having said that, I might begin to sound as if I'm a proponent of military intervention. Let me give you some of the sobering downsides of all of this. This is not a regime that can be pushed over. This is not Libya. This is a regime that has strength and depth. It has a capacity to be brutal. It has shown that it will be brutal. It has sent the tanks out against its own people. And it has a serious air force, and it has a capability actually to shoot down anything that comes at it. And it will use it. We must assume that this is a serious regime. People have said, for instance, why haven't we got safe zones? Why haven't we got safe havens? I was the British official who actually agreed that strategy with the Americans. Let me remind you, at the time in Iraq, Saddam Hussein had just been defeated. Our planes were deployed. We had not just air superiority, we had air supremacy. And we were still challenged. And it wasn't a simple project. And what's more, we had favorable geographies. We did not do what you might have done, was we did not actually challenge him in the Baghdad area. What we said is you can't go into the Marsh Arabs and muck them up, and you mustn't go up into Kurdistan either and attempt actually to defeat the Kurds and go after the Kurds on the ground. And he kept him out of large parts of his own territory, not his capital. Those conditions will be much harder to replicate in Syria. So what I'm saying is that even to do what we might regard as fairly simple things are much harder in the Syrian context. And were we to go for an intervention, we must reckon we will be going for a full-scale war.
Two things. One, you did not answer the two questions I asked.
Yes, I did. I told you there'd be an increase in terrorism.
About Israel and the minorities. And secondly, my personal view of the Syrian army is that I think that its capacity is overblown. I think that the RAF or even the Royal Danish Air Force will have quite a big lever against Syrian air defense. But could you just briefly comment on what I asked? Because I do think that the concerns of the minorities and the legitimate security concerns of Israel are very important in this context.
Well, the concerns of the minorities, it seems to me, are very profound human rights issue. I'm not sure they're a quote, classic security issue. I think that as we perceive the situation at the moment, it does look as if the minorities in Syria fear what might be the outcome of a Sunni majority government. I would say, actually, I share the view that was earlier on, is that their long-term situation is not good in any event, and I don't actually think they've been worse off necessarily under a different regime. And I think we have to take that risk. I don't believe that trying to preserve the situation in Aspic in the name of preserving and protecting the minorities is actually a sensible policy. So I think there are risks all round, but I think it's a greater one is trying to stay with that. The concerns of Israel, of course, absolutely. For Israel, Israel's been notably quiet on this issue, has she not? And Israel very sensibly does not want conflict on two fronts. She doesn't want have to deal with Iran, as she's preoccupied by, and also have conflict and trouble in Syria as well. All I would say is that I don't think that Syria over the long term is any longer a secure partner for Israel's security. So I think there is a necessary crisis that we have to go through. The question is, how do we do it?
Thank you very much. Carl, you were gesturing. You wanted some brief intervention, or it was just a wave of hand?
No, I think the question of minorities is critical in this particular case for a number of reasons, also for the balance of forces inside the country. I think the Alawites are going to fight because they feel that if they are defeated, they will be defeated to the last person. And they might, it's going to be sort of, for them, it's a Lebanon thing. The question is the Christians who are not, I don't think they've been supporting the regime, really. They've been sort of
fearing the future.
Although the regime was quite heavily relying on all minorities.
Well, absolutely. But I don't think they were enthusiastic about the regime, but they were able to survive under this particular regime in a somewhat difficult Middle East. And accordingly, they are somewhat fearful of the future. And the question is there any way in which one can prevent them? I don't think they will fight, but they might well flee. And then we are talking about very big numbers indeed, very big numbers indeed. And if we see those numbers moving into Lebanon, Lebanon is nervous when 10 people cross the border, because when 10 people cross the border, it shifts the ethnic balance. I'm exaggerating slightly for the sake of the argument. So if you have 2 million Christians coming into Lebanon, that's the end of Lebanon. If you have them coming into Jordan, that's also the ethnic balance there with Palestinians. They're also very nervous about these things. So it's an exceedingly complex issue that, I think argues very, very heavily for trying to get the political process. Pressure to get the political process in all sorts of different ways. But if it descends into sectarian civil war, long, broad, and brutal.
Before we make Kurt Volker to pay for the sins of at least 3 American administrations, very briefly, Ambassador Önhon, you wanted to say something, but really 30 seconds, no more than that.
Well, then I use my right later, but because I want to say something on minorities and the Islamist regimes.
Okay, then we'll come back to that later. Kurt, the floor is yours.
All right.
To answer for everything. And by the way, I feel like most panelists are afraid of one 4-letter word, and not the one you thought about, but Iran. So if you mention it, that would really be great.
I will mention that. I will address Pauline's question and a couple of others. But let me say 2 things up front and then come to some points. Complex, yes. Difficult, yes. Is there an easy military solution? No. Okay, so that's all out there. But let me start now with 2 philosophical questions and then a couple practical points of analysis. The first philosophical question is, how many dead Syrians is enough? Assad goes in the middle of the night, intelligence or special police round up somebody, they shoot him, and he's dead. That's not going to cause an intervention. Does it twice, that's not going to cause an intervention. So clearly there's a low threshold. Take the opposite extreme. He goes out, he digs up his chemical weapons, and he goes village by village and exterminates village after village. You have 20,000, 25,000, 30,000. Do you think that we're all just going to stand by and just wait until he's done? I don't think so. So I think that there's a threshold here. Now, clearly, a year and 10,000 people and shelling his own cities is acceptable. because we've all accepted it. We haven't acted to stop that. At some point, though, I'd argue that there is a threshold here where it can't be acceptable anymore. Now, a second philosophical point is if you think that he's determined to go there, if your genuine assessment is he thinks he's winning, he's going to do what it takes to hang on to power, and this threshold is not a factor for him, and I believe that, I think that's where we are, then is it better to wait till we cross it and then do something? Or is it better to prevent and to save more lives in the process? So I think those are two important philosophical questions to think about. It doesn't make it easy, but I think we have a real moral problem with where we are. Now, a couple practical points of analysis, and this gets to your very first question, I'm happy to say, which is, what are we saving Syria from? I think we're saving Syria from a false choice. You have a false choice presented all the time between an authoritarian regime that we live with or violent extremism that takes over. That is not where most of the people in Syria want to be. It's not what most people believe. It's not the only option that's out there. So I think that vast space, it's the vast space that the ambassador of Turkey talked about in terms of where most people feel themselves. It's also the vast space in terms of population and in terms of belief. That's what I think the struggle is for, is can we assure an alternative other than these two extremes? The second question you asked was about the role of outside groups. And that is exactly to this point, because there are lots of others who are trying to occupy this space in their own way, whether it's the authoritarian regime itself, or whether it's Al-Qaeda, or other violent extremists, or even some other outside powers. And I won't make you responsible for Russia like Alaa, but nonetheless, I think Russia is playing for its own interests in this. So I do think that there is a question we should also ask ourselves about what can we do to support the majority of the people and their desire to develop this space between these extremes and live in a normal society. The third practical point, this gets to Carl's point about history. You're absolutely right. I agree with you about the complexity and the nature of these regimes falling, but I would put a different take on it. The old Middle East that we have lived with and analyzed and just had to get along with over the last 50 or 60 years is going away, and it's not coming back. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, still tension in Bahrain, Syria, and it's not going to stop there. I think the genie's out of the bottle on the people of the Middle East demanding greater justice and respect and opportunity in their own society. And they're not going to just leave these regimes the way they were. So it's going to change. And I think a question that all of us have to face is, what side do we want to be on in this change? Do we want to be on the side of people demanding rights, or do we want to be on the side, through passivity, of the regimes who are trying to prevent that? And do we want to be on the side that ultimately comes out as one that is better for people, or the side that had acted to try to prevent that for as long as possible? And final practical point is a question about U.S. and EU role, which you asked, and it gets to Pauline's point. First off, I think the U.S. and the EU are acting principally out of self-interest, which is we have problems, we have economic issues, we have unhappy populations, we have our own things to deal with, and this is hard and difficult, and therefore we can't take this on right now. And I think if there's a lesson that we've learned from Libya is that Libya was harder and messier than we thought it might be, and we certainly don't want to do that again, and Syria is even harder. So I think it's a very self-reflective approach. It has very little to do with Syria, in fact. Despite the convenience of arguments of complexity and difficulty, it has more to do with ourselves. And to the US point about Asia, which is what Pauline asked about, Asia is exciting and dynamic and economically growing, and it holds a lot of our debt. And I think that's the exciting part for the United States, is we can forget, and I'm actually quoting here, we can forget a decade of war and move on to a different kind of decade of investing in economies and economic growth and things. But I think Pauline is right. You don't get to those other things if the world is on fire. We're seeing some of the most important parts of the world that are challenging both security, real security interests, and our values all at the same time. You don't get to the rest of it unless we deal with this now.
You know what? You did not mention Iran. And you were the fifth one, you know.
Well, let me mention Iran, because I did have that in my notes. Because it gets to this point about the long term. It's changing anyway. And right now you have Iran as one of these outside actors that is trying to influence this space. As I talk, there's a space between the extremism and the authoritarianism. And Iran is trying to play its role to gain its influence in this as well. And it has used Syria.
I think the question is that it had the influence for 30 years. It was bankrolling the Syrian regime.
And it has used Syria. And has used that as a vehicle also to then support Hamas and Hezbollah. And I think that we have a question. Which way does this influence go in the future? Does Iran continue to enjoy and exert that influence? Or does a opening up Middle East, not to say democratizing, but a democratizing Middle East, at least one that respects its population more, that provides a measure of accountability of government, a measure of greater justice, a step away from extremism, does that kind of Middle East have more of an impact on Iran? And I think it probably does.
Thank you very much, but another question I wanted to ask you, because you have to speak for Obama administration. Could you explain to us? Of course, you can't figure out what actually is the policy with regard to Syria. Okay, you understand with Libya, Obama wanted to take a kind of backseat because he wanted, it to be seen as a European thing, no American neocolonialism, no mention of another four-letter word, NATO, and things like that. So, with regard to Syria, it seems that he's delegated everything to Secretary Clinton, but is there a clear-cut policy with regard to Syria? I mean, what does the U.S. want to achieve?
Well, it wouldn't be fair of me to speak on behalf of the Obama administration. I don't
Just be a detached analyst.
I don't think they would like the way I would characterize that. But let me say that I think what Carl said is also a fairly accurate description of how I see the U.S. thinking. Mm-hmm. Let's hope. Let's hope that something will happen that will generate the possibility of a political solution, because all the other things are too hard to think about. And that, I think, is where we still are. And I frankly don't see that being effective. It hasn't been effective for a year. I think that over the last few months, Assad has become more confident rather than less confident that the way things are going, he's going to end up on top. So I think that is the assessment. And it does get back to what I said, though. We have an election. We have a very difficult economy. We have a population that is tired of a lot of bad news. I think the administration does want to get away from military conflict that we've been involved in for 10 years. And the fact that we may have to face up to this again is just too unpleasant to face.
Thanks a million. I have to thank the panel because it was so brief and so to the point that we have 35 minutes for questions. That's unheard of in the annals of international conferences. But before that, I see two people want to make an observation. So probably Ambassador you, because you indicated first, and then Alaa. Please.
Well, thank you. I have to point out to 5 minor issues, or briefly. One of them is as long as this conflict goes on, radicalism will be on the rise. I mean, that is experience from other parts of the world. So this conflict must end soon. And the international community must do whatever it should do. Political solution, of course, that is the preferred solution. We support the Annan plan very strongly. We hope that it will succeed. But is it succeeding? I mean, I have a big question mark, because the Syrian regime, unfortunately, takes the Annan plan as a list which it can pick and choose from. Yeah. And that is not how a plan works. So the international community should be prepared for alternatives, hoping that the Annan plan would work. But if it doesn't work, what should we do? Should we say, well, we tried, we didn't succeed, so bad luck? We cannot do that. You use the term Islamist regime. I think that's not the right term, really, because
I thought you'd say that.
Yeah, I would really, because 70% of Syria is Sunni. But that doesn't change the fact that they are all Syrians. I mean, Syria has a special social and demographic fabric and a built-in secularity, actually. And in the future, in the new Syria, we hope, when there are free and fair elections, it doesn't mean that everybody will vote for its own sect or religion. I mean, that is not what Syria is all about. And if, for the sake of argument, if Muslim Brotherhood comes out of the ballot box, can you say no to that? I mean, defending the principles of democracy? Maybe it will, maybe it will not, but that's something else. And the last thing is the minority issue. Again, one of the cards that the regime is playing is to divide the country into camps. Sunnis here, Alawites and Christians there. And again, that's very unfair, and it's a trap that we should not fall into. Because if you look at the opposition, you will see that there are many Alawites in the street, and also in the people who are, let's say, initiating this revolution. But the regime is playing this card. I mean, it uses the argument, the false argument, that on the one hand we have the extremist Sunnis, on the other hand we have the Alawites, the secular Sunnis, the Christians. And that is a trap, and we should not fall into that trap. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alaa, briefly.
I actually had the same comment on the Islamist regimes. I don't think that's appropriate because I don't think they're regimes if they've been elected, right? I think the label, the Western label of Islamist, is very misleading because you have in Tunis, in Turkey even, a party that is Islamic, and probably in Libya it looks like we're going to have the same thing. But that is the choice of the people. And who is anybody else to call it a regime? Because I could say the same about Russia, the Russian regime, or anybody could say...
You can, by the way.
I just did. I just tried to do it nicely.
Thank you very much.
But I'm saying that the fundamentals of democracy is that the people, the citizens of the country, choose their government. It is not to us to call it a regime. Gaddafi was a regime because he was not chosen. My second point is on Israel, which I think that when we talk about democracy and we talk about the respect of human rights and the respect of minorities and the respect of religion, because I think that's something that people always forget in the Middle East, is respect of all religions and all denominations of religions. I think the only way for Israel in the long run to be 100% secure is through the democratization of the Middle East and through that relationship with those countries. Because as long as it has regimes which support it, but their population doesn't support them, and as long as there is all these little pockets of turbulence within the Middle East, you will not have a secure Israel. You will continue to have economies which lose a lot of money because they give Israel a lot of money. You will continue to have a country which is always unstable. You will continue to have settlements being built. You will continue to have other, particularly now the newly democratic, I would say, countries saying, well, we need to protect Palestine. And this will end up blowing into what I think would be the full-scale war eventually. I think that in order to prevent that, we have to now look at, okay, Syria without the Assad regime, with or without, to be honest, is no help to Israel, I think. But without the Assad regime, we have the opportunity for the younger generation, which I think is a lot more open-minded than everybody gives them credit for, to say, listen, let's learn about each other's religions, let's learn about each other's cultures, and there is that opportunity for growth. With the Assad regime, there never will be that opportunity. And I think that's something we actually have to look at if we're looking at Israel within the Middle East. With the current regimes, it actually only creates more antagonism in the society for the country of Israel.
Of course, when I was speaking about the Islamist regimes, I meant those who will come to power by ballot, and then they'll say, it's actually one man, one vote, one time. Then it turns into a regime. If it doesn't, as it is in Tunisia, then of course it's different.
But you can call it an Islamist regime until it's actually a regime.
Well, that's true, philosophically true. 30 minutes, a very generous time, I think, before the participants in this so far excellent panel can make their final statements. So please ask questions and identify yourself, please. Yes, sir, Fadl.
Simon Saif Liazal from Egypt. I'm chairman of the Al Qamariya Center for Political and Security Studies. I believe we have in Syria, to answer a question, which is what we can do, I think it's very important. I think we have to do three things. And this is, I am a retired general in the Egyptian army, so I'm very close, or at least I know quite well the Syrian army. The demonstrators and the revolutionaries in Syria, they need information. So we don't say that we have to go and bomb by NATO Syrians, just like we did in Libya. But the point now is information. We have to supply information to the demonstrators. For instance, we have the satellite cameras, we have the unmanned pilot reconnaissance airplane. We have to get the information and tell the people Bashar's coming to that village or coming, because we have to minimize the death number of people, because now it's exceeding 11,000 and more than 40,000 injuries. So by minimizing that, the only way is to tell them he is coming towards you now. So be careful. We are not doing that. So we have to feed them with information as soon as possible. This is number one. Number two, financial support. They need money. I'm talking about the the Free Syrian Army and the revolutionists. All the revolutionists over there, they need money. And we have to give them some money. Not to buy weapon, but at least to be ready for Assad's crisis. This is number two. Number three, maybe at the time, maybe not now, but at the time, we need to supply them with a kind of defensive, I would say, equipment. Mm-hmm. They need that. Maybe this is the third stage, not now. Again, regarding...
Such as what?
Such as...
Anti-aircraft?
No, not tanks, not artilleries, not anti-aircraft. No, but we're talking about small missiles which you can attack tanks coming towards you and actually to stop them, to come to near your villages or streets, and this kind of defensive things. The point of when we're going to see his regime goes, this is a very important point. For your information, Assad is Alawite, as you know. And all the troops in Damascus, all of them, every single unit is only from Alawite group. So they very much loyal to him. He depends on them, and they will never do anything against Al-Assad. So as soon as you see some of these troops goes to the other side, then you say congratulations. And this is not happening now. The last point which you have to know as well, and this is again very important, we haven't seen any massive demonstrations or massive marches in Damascus. As soon as you start to see that, which is not happening. Yes, we saw day before yesterday 2 blasts, but this is again suicide bombs. But as soon as you see a massive, just like Daraa, like Homs, like Hama, when you see massive demonstrations, people goes in the street saying, down Al-Assad in Damascus, then we start to have maybe the right hope. But up till now, it doesn't happen. And I don't think it will happen soon, unfortunately.
Thanks for your remarks. Matthew Bryza, please.
Thanks very much, Matthew Bryza, the new director of ICDS. Thank you all again for being here, and thank you for a terrific and insightful discussion. I wondered if we could explore a little bit more the one man, one vote, one time proposition. I'm sure every single person in this room strongly agrees with everything Alaa said about, and everybody else, about the right and the need of all the people of the Middle East to determine their own political futures through democracy. Here we sit in Europe, not far from Germany, where in the 1930s, a democratic election brought an ideology to power that led to one terrible man, one vote, one time. So what are the prescriptions, the practical prescriptions for how to deal with this potential problem, given the ideologies that could be elected? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who does want to answer? Pauline.
Well,
and then Kurt will follow. Yes, please.
No, what I think is important to grasp is that democracy is not just about having an election and having a majority emerge from it. First of all, majorities have to observe and respect and protect the rights of minorities. That is the fear that the Christians have, that their rights and their faith will not be protected. And that is something, it's no point in dismissing it, it's a real fear, and it has some justification, I think, in observed fact. Second thing about democracy is its institutions. And this is the great problem, is how you build the institutions, and that can only be done over a period of time. So this is a very long process. And one of our difficulties in all the revolutions that we see is that a new political complex sweeps into power, but does not have the institutional base that then actually helps it limit its own actions and behave according to a rule of law. And it's the establishment of the rule of law, and that's where post-regime revolution has to be helped by NGOs, by other agencies, to get the new fabric of a state established. And I think we're still very bad at that. And the Arab Spring in other countries is going to be a real test of that.
Everyone wants to add up. So Kurt, you were the first.
All right, well, I'll just make two brief points. One of them is partly in response to Matt, the echo point that Alaa made. Islam and violent extremist Islam are not the same thing.
No.
And you won't have democratic politics in the Middle East without Islam. So I think we have to change the way we think about this and make it part of our assumption. Yes, you're going to have Islam and political parties that espouse Islam as part of the political structure that goes on. And you made the point that we didn't coordinate, but just as you have Christian democratic parties in Europe from the 1950s that are still around today. And that doesn't mean religion and politics are mingling badly in Europe, and it doesn't have to mingle badly in the Middle East. What we have to talk about are instead the principles by which anyone needs to be judged as acting in a democratic system. Tolerance, respect for the institutions, respect for law, respect for minorities, all of the things that we would attribute as the right kind of democratic behavior. And with Pauline's point about it being it's not just elections, but obviously a whole apparatus of democratic society, yes, which is why the sooner we get on with it, the better, because it's not going to get easier or any closer if that is seen as, I'm not saying you're saying this, but if that's seen as a reason for not having transition, that's not a good answer. And just to the point from the Egyptian, I really appreciated your comments, because when people talk about military option, it's kind of also this false set of choices. Either it's massive intervention outside any form of law, occupy the country, hated external force against a local population. There's no reason why external intervention or external support for the population has to be defined that way. And I think there's a lot of options that we could develop if that's what we were putting our mind to, rather than putting our mind to the reasons why it's difficult.
I think some of them are evolving, actually. Yeah.
Carl, Alaa, and Mr.
Well,
Wilson. Very briefly.
On that particular point, some of these things exactly is what's being done now. I mean, the fact that, monitors are too few. Even when there are 300, it's going to be too few. But they will have that effect. And they will be supported by overhead assets as well. So we will know what's moving and be able to alert people. And there's been a calming effect. I mean, the level of violence is down. It is far too high, but it is down. And the question is, can we continue on that particular trajectory? Second issue, I agree with everyone. Political Islam is going to be the reality of that part of the world. It's unlikely to be secular societies any longer. It's going to raise some difficult human rights issues in terms of minorities and women's rights and whatever. We need to engage with it. Our first experience, Hamas, after the 2006 election has probably not been a smashing success. We have to recognize that. And we have to learn from that particular experience and engage broadly with political Islam as the reality as we move towards democratic societies.
Alaa.
I actually wanted to make two comments quickly on yours about the mass protests in Damascus being a sign. I can honestly say I doubt that will ever happen, simply because up until the day of liberation of Tripoli, we did not have a single mass protest, because the fear is too much. And so I think even you might be on the brink of the liberation of Damascus and there won't be a mass protest. I don't think that's a fair sign to wait for. In regards to political Islam and it bringing up some human rights issues, I think if the international community approaches the growth of Islam in the Middle East, it will bode, first and foremost, so much better for international relations. As we've seen in Libya, the fact that the international community supported their democracy without knowing what the future would hold, but supported it, has created a very, very strong sense of appreciation for the role that the West took, and almost has taken away from the support that they gave Gaddafi, which I think is a very good reason to get involved in the in the democracy of the Middle East. Secondly, in terms of women's rights and minorities, I think if we all kind of step back from our understanding of Islam and our understanding of what I'm sure Hamas was not the best example, but what certain previous regimes or terrorist groups have done, we actually have to look at Islam and hope that if we can embrace political Islam and the growth of political Islam, actual Islam will be what is translated into politics. And it can happen in any country where it can be taken to extremes. I understand that that's a fear of the international community. But I think if we keep always going in with the perception that, oh, Libya now has an elected Islamic party or Turkey has an elected Islamic party, let's all get very scared for the women. I think that kind of tells the country itself, like, oh, they don't understand and now they're judging. For us, as we work with a women's NGO, it has only been through Islam that we've accomplished anything in Libya.
I'm sorry, Ambassador, we have too many people who registered to ask questions, so please be brief.
Okay, well, I'll say Islam and democracy, they are not incompatible. I want to underline that. Secondly, democracy is a culture and we cannot expect it to grow overnight, so we have to give time. And thirdly, in Syria, we are talking about a process. If the Assad regime goes, the next day everything will not be bright. We will probably have a period of turbulence again, but it's a part of a process, and I think we should be ready for that, and we should be realistic in our expectations.
Thanks a million. We have Leila from Azerbaijan, then Andrei Piankovsky, then Bobolo, and then probably the gentleman in the back. That's how I saw people raising their hands. If you have time, I'm sorry, sir. Too many questions. Leila. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was, Natalie. I meant you, yeah.
Hello, I'm Natalie from Paris, from Le Monde. Natalie Noguered. I wanted to draw the discussion back to Syria and Russia. We've agreed that if we are to avoid the sort of major violent outbreak, chaos, regional strife, the solution is political. The main obstacle, it seems, to that political solution and strong pressure on Assad has been Russia, it seems to me. So what are we ready to put on the table to get the Russians to shift their position? What is America ready to put on the table? Kurt, you said that the Russians were playing their interests. Could you elaborate on that?
Who are you asking?
I'm asking Kurt, and I'm also asking Pauline and Carl Bildt, what should Europe be putting on the table? How high should Europe be putting Syria on its list of priorities in its dealing with Russia? And again, we're talking about regional stability in a part of the world where we agree the strategic issues are absolutely huge. One small detail, not a detail actually. Pauline, you said that the Syrian and the Iran crisis could come together. How does that play with Russia? Thanks.
Pauline, probably you'll start, and then Kurt.
Okay. Russia is of course, the player in this, which it would be crucial if Russia switched her position and her role. Hitherto, I think it's fair to say that she started out, I think, really by trying to pursue a policy of covertly and not so covertly supporting the regime, then getting them, really encouraging them to deal with this issue quickly and neatly. Now, I think, is much more concerned about the implications for Moscow more broadly in the region. And I think Russian policy is moving. We need actually to have, what I think is going to be difficult with Russia is actually somehow to put pressure on Moscow. We don't have many cards to play, if you think about it. And look, remember, in all of this, the military assets, we still have a conflict going on in Afghanistan. Russian help and cooperation in that area is really quite important to us. So it has to be one where I think it is more a discussion of persuasion and dialogue than it is you form up now because if you don't, we're going to do the following. Because I don't think we have much following to put into that. However, I don't despair, I think, of Russian policy changing. We certainly, now that Putin's back in power, need to have a conversation with him directly, not just with Lavrov. Whether that will produce change, don't know, but we now need to talk to the man at the top. Would the Russians actually resist an intervention, a military intervention on the part of Western countries, which, I mean, as I say, I don't think we should exclude. You should never exclude these things, because that in itself is a political act. As I say, I think it has very huge implications. I think you couldn't be certain, what the Russian response would be. My guess is that they would put plenty of obstacles in its way. Whether they would actually intervene on the Syrian side, I think, is a separate question. So ultimately, the West does have some cards, but you don't want to take the crisis that far. So I think that this is an area where you're right to say it does now need to be a focus of dialogue, and it's going to be very important, I think, in US diplomacy. And as far as the Russians are concerned, it's the US who are the players. I have to tell you, I don't actually think that the European Union will get very far. As for one last thing, Iran. My fear, of course, is that the kind of covert assistance that's already coming from Iran for the regime will increase massively. And that is, that is something we can't just ignore. Also, in the outward consequences of an increase in military tension and an increase in military involvement, we come back to was a feature of Iraq, which we can't exclude, which would be an increase in terrorism. And where would that be coming from? It would be coming partly from Iran.
Kurt.
Okay, I'll try to be.
I'm not saying this is a reason for not doing it, but what I'm saying is do understand that will be one of the consequences.
I know you want me to be brief. I agree that Russia is moving. I would call that movement tap dancing.
We've got to try and convert it into a real dance.
No. I think Assad thinks he's winning. I think the Russians think Assad is winning. And so nobody's moving in that respect. How do you get Russia to move? I think the more likely Russia thinks it is that we're going to do something without them, the more likely it will be that they will then try to get in seriously on whatever it is the international community does. At the moment, their single greatest point of leverage is through the UN Security Council, and because the rest of us aren't willing anyway, they've been able to use that fairly effectively. If they think that we are ready to move anyway, then we have a greater chance of getting Russia to come on board. And I would make another philosophical point, but I'll restrain myself.
Well, why I wanted you to be brief, because I didn't want to be seen as kind of a hive in Arabic and someone who fears to speak. I think there's one thing to understand about the Russian position, in my personal view, about Syria. And it is a position that stems from the perception that Russia was bamboozled over the Libyan operation, that it was led to believe that something is going to happen that actually was expanded into something else. And I think that apart from the arms sales and the naval station in Tartus and things like that, it is very much an attempt to show the world that this is our last stand, the Kremlin's last stand, and we will not allow anyone, including the Security Council, to decide who is going to run which country. And this is a very important point, I think, for Putin to make, because it is essentially not a foreign policy point, but a domestic point.
But Konstantin, doesn't that show that the Russians are much more concerned with what they think they're trying to stop the Americans doing than that they understand what's going on in the Arab world? Because they're getting the wrong side of history.
I think you're quite right. And I think that the Arab world was, and still is, to some extent, neglected in Russian foreign policy.
Absolutely.
Because it's not a vital... the Arab world is not at the heart of Russian security interests, and never will be. So that's why you can allow yourself to be a bit more flexible. Now, Andrei Piankovsky, please, from Moscow.
Thank you. A very short remark on the previous issue. Certainly, Putin supports so stubbornly Assad, not of some great geopolitical interest, but first of all, out of corporate solidarity. Because any additional foreign dictator in the Middle East is a very bad sign for Putin, it's a reminder to him that he will be the next. And this is the secret of his special position on Syria. And very short question. As it's crystal clear for this discussion, West will not interfere under any circumstances. There is no moral threshold for him in Syria dilemma. My question is there some moral or political threshold for Turkey? Is Turkey potentially ready to intervene at some stage on its own?
Yes, please.
Well, I mean, what I would say is we have common borders with Syria, 911 kilometers, and whatever happens in that country, unfortunately, affects us security-wise also. Up to date, we have had 24,000 refugees in Turkish territory. Sometimes it increased up to 35,000, 30,000. Now, Turkey wants a political solution. That is for sure. We are against any kind of military intervention because we have seen that the consequences are not really very enviable from other experiences. But if one day we wake up and suddenly find, let's say, 200,000 people on our borders, then of course we'll have to do something about it. And I'm not implying anything, but let us not forget that Turkey is a NATO member. And any violation of Turkish territory is also an act against an alliance. So take that all together and you may come to your own conclusions.
Thank you very much. Bobolo, please.
Thank you. Bobolo, independent scholar. My question really is, it's not about the why, the what, or even the who, but it's, again, how. Kurt, you mentioned about a moral threshold, and we can argue where that moral threshold might find itself. But my question really is, let's assume that we do reach that moral threshold. How are you going to intervene effectively? I understand your point about the use of the intervention may not necessarily mean massive, irresistible force, and that there are a range of other options. But equally, you could argue, well, what happens when those options don't achieve the results you're looking for? And my problem here is not just that America is knackered, that Europe is knackered, that there isn't the will. But there's also the Russia problem, which has been described here, but also another country which no one has mentioned here, which is China. So you might just conceivably, under certain circumstances, maybe find a way to sidestep Russia, although I doubt it. But what about China? So really, how are you going to make it happen?
This is fortunate because it gets to the other philosophical point I was going to make, which is,
do we have philosophers?
We have time. We talk about right to protect in the context of regimes. So a regime that fails to protect its people is one that is called into question. Is it really a legitimate regime because it is not protecting its people? It's attacking its people. So that's how we talk about right to protect. I think we should talk about the Security Council also in the same context. If Security Council is failing in its duty under its charter to provide international peace and security and also to protect all of the values and human rights that are enshrined in the UN Charter and the Declaration on Human Rights, I think the UN is failing in its job as a right to protect as well. This is not something to argue lightly, but at the same time, the notion that we should be paralyzed because Russia says that we don't like the idea of outside intervention in the affairs of others just as a matter of principle because we don't want it to apply to us. That's not a very satisfying place to end up at the end of a discussion about what is the right moral outcome for a conflict. We faced this in Kosovo, and in Kosovo there was an air campaign launched by NATO to force Serbian paramilitaries to withdraw. They did. And after that, Russia did join in a UN Security Council resolution to put in place a peacekeeping force, partly because they didn't want to be isolated from what came next.
Then we have two questions, and I'll collect them. The gentleman behind Bobo Law, and then the gentleman here in the yellow tie. Yes, please, over there.
I'm Hussein Bastani from the BBC Persian Service. I have a question for Alaa or any other of the panelists about the position of Israel in the Syrian conflict. The Syrian government accuses Israel of interfering in the recent unrest in Syria, but they have not been able to prove this accusation until now. And my question is that whether you think Israel prefers the toppling of Assad regime, because as far as Assad is in power, it helps Hezbollah, it connects Iran to Hezbollah, and as far as Hezbollah is in place, the security of Israel is threatened. Or you believe, Syria is a controlled enemy for Israel, but you are not sure about the future of Syria after the toppling of Bashar Assad regime. So they prefer the Syrian existing regime to be in power. What is your perception of the position of Israel in this conflict?
Thank you very much, you, sir. And then we have one last question from the gentleman near the camera. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm George Chaplin, MEP for Hungary. My question is this. Do you think there is such a thing as a Syrian people? If the answer is yes, we're talking about the necessary level of cohesiveness, solidarity, cultural intimacy, etc. And then, of course, one person, one vote can work. If the answer is no, shouldn't we be thinking about consociational solutions?
Thank you. And you, sir.
Okay, Andrew Mekta, GMF. A very quick question, stipulating what Matt said about the negative outcomes, one man, one vote, one time, and also agreeing with what Kurt said about Islam being part of the landscape. I think we need to accept that, we need to work with that. Could anybody on the panel comment, how do we act if things start going in the wrong direction? And I'm not just talking about Syria, I'm talking about the region as a whole. What corrective action can we take collectively or individually as the European Union states or as the United States or together to then, having accepted the premise that we want to allow the processes to work, when we see them going in the wrong direction, what tools do we have? Thank you.
So we're taking the questions as they come. So it's Israel and Syria. Is there such thing as Syrian people? And what is the way to correct the situation if it spins out of control? So who wants to start? Alaa, please.
Quickly on Israel and Syria, I think that Israel was used as a scapegoat, and it is being used as a scapegoat by the Syrian regime for them to hold on to whatever they can. But I do think that it is another reason that the Syrian regime needs to go, because, again, Israel will not be safe with the Syrian regime. Over the past 1 year, we've seen that that Hezbollah has supported the death of Syrian citizens in support of this regime. So we're seeing a strengthening relationship between Syria and Palestine, or extremist factions in Palestine and Iran. And that does not bode well for Middle East security either. So as much as my views on the Israel-Palestine issue are quite varied, but I do think in this regard Israel is unfortunately being used as a scapegoat, and a very good one by the Syrian regime. In regards to what the international community can do if things ever get too far with an Islamic government, again, I think up until that point, the international community needs to be extremely supportive of whatever democratic government is in place. Because what we've noticed now in Libya is the fact that we did not have any international governments allowed in Libya for so many years, or to have any influence, is that the UN, the EU, and most bilateral countries have a very light footstep. And they are not able now, when they see something going wrong, to really say anything. They don't have very much clout. And I think that the only way for them to have influence is if over time they show support for the democratic transition. If then in 5, 10, 15, 20 years something does end up going wrong, they have been there, they have been supportive, they have been reliable. But it does not make sense for, from the very get-go, them to say, well, you guys are going to have an Islamic regime. We're just waiting for when it happens. It won't really bode well for their relationship.
Ambassador Ömer, very briefly, please.
Very briefly on two questions. One of them is what if things go wrong? I think we should not be prejudiced. I mean, if this is the right term, and we should have a little bit faith. I mean, Taliban is not the only example for the Islamic world. That is my answer to that. I mean, that's my thoughts. And on whether is there a Syrian people? Of course. I mean, we can ask this question for Europe, for others. I mean, if we
I think the inferences, I'm sorry to interrupt, as far as I understood, is on the sectarian divides running so deep that you cannot speak about the Syrian nation unless something external, like a regime that the Assad family had for many years, holds it together.
Yeah, well, the Syrian people lived together for centuries from whatever religion or background. But now, as I said, it is the regime which is trying to bring up this sectarian strife.
Carl, do you want to comment on questions that were asked?
Yeah, I mean, the Syrian people lived there for a long time, obviously, but never under democracy. It's always been under authoritarian rule. That might have been the Umayyads, if you go back, the Caliphate a long time. Yeah, quite some time ago. The Turks, whatever. It's always been an authoritarian-run place, the Levant. Now it has to do the transition to this democracy. And it's not going to be an easy one. And the question, what will happen if things go wrong? We are talking about a historical transformation of an entire region. Things will go wrong. History is not a linear process. I wish it was. This is going to play out over a long period of time. Look at Iraq after 2003. There were heavy war until, say, 2006, 2007 or something like that. It is today a fragile political process. Are we certain where Iraq is going to end up in 5 years' time? No, we aren't. And we have to see things in the Middle East. Do we know where Egypt is going to be 5 years from now? The only thing that we can do, which is not little, and we have to do it, is I would engage with the political change, engage with the emerging political forces that are going to be there. It's not necessarily the people that a lot of us are going to vote for, but we are not the electorate there. They are the electorate there, and we have to respect their particular choices, and then help them fundamentally with also the economic transformation. I mean, the sectarian issue has been highlighted here. I think that's right, but we should not forget the economic issues. It's the economic despair and decay of the region that also makes it much more difficult. It's not Libya, because that's the oil, but in Egypt, in Syria and other places, that needs to be addressed, and it can't be addressed without our help and with engaging with the political forces. But over time, lots of things are going to be wrong. Let's make certain that we can help that overall, over a prolonged period of time, it goes right.
Kurt, as the Americans usually do, have the last word.
Oh, okay. Well, quickly, George, on your question, I mean, you seem to be implying that unless you have a homogenous state, you can't have a democracy. That's certainly not the experience that I think a lot of us have observed even in Europe. In fact, it's only really through democracy you finally get to resolve some of these minority issues. On the point that Andrew raised, what happens if things go wrong? Isn't that what we're watching? Aren't things going wrong? So I think the question is, as Carl said, how do you engage to try to make them better? And ultimately, things may continue to be difficult and bad. All you can do is support the things that you support and stand against the things that you oppose, rather than trying to game it somehow.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think it was a perfect session, and I would like to ask you to join me in thanking the participants and saying to them, shukran, tak, teşekkür, and thank you.